Welcome to the ASPR podcast Inside Conflict with Moritz Ehrmann. So welcome once again to this second episode of ASPR's podcast Inside Conflict, focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We are here now in our third session with Dr. Carlo Aldovandi, Jeff Sohl, and Ofer Salzberg. Welcome once again. In this third segment, we're going to look at the international dimension of the current setup in Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in general as well. After, of course, having discussed the very interesting and yet very complicated setup of the current Israeli government, and what would that mean for the question of integrating more diverse worldviews, including religious identities, into peacemaking efforts around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So perhaps now looking from an American perspective at the impact of exclusion or inclusion of religion regarding US policies towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Jeff, what would you think about this interesting question?
Well, Carlo insightfully observed earlier that this conflict has, extra-regional significance, geopolitical significance, and that this isn't only about politics, as people in the West tend to understand that term. It's also about religion and diverse meaning-making systems. And this is true in the United States as well. This conflict in the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque complex that we were speaking about is significant to diverse communities in the U.S., including the Christian evangelical community or segments of it. And that broad community has had an important influence, obviously, on U.S. politics over the last several decades. Things are very fluid in the U.S. right now. We have a relatively new administration. By some accounts, it's beginning to falter. We have midterm elections coming up and a sort of new congressional map that that people are predicting is going to potentially give Republicans control of the House. So the evangelical community that arguably had a sort of larger voice and influence on the past administration may soon have renewed influence. But I think it's also important to recognize that community is changing in the U.S. Youth have a different relationship to this site and this conflict, this issue, than perhaps their elders have had. And the Jewish community in the U.S. is changing as well. Similar generational changes. So I think, like we were saying about the conflict itself and the new administration in Israel, it's sort of too early to tell where all this is headed, and I think the same can be said about the U.S. context in this regard. There's a lot of dislocation and change, and it's a little too early to know exactly what that means, in my view.
Building on Jeff, I studied quite closely the development within evangelical Christianity, and over at least three administrations, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration, and the Trump administration. So you see changes, substantial changes. So the evangelical community, for religious reasons, attached to eschatology and the prophetic role of Israel, promoted hugely, gave political support usually to the State of Israel during the Bush administration and then the aftermath of 9/11, and then it went more or less dormant during the Obama years to become again very relevant during the Trump administration. But now, as Jeff highlighted, there is a new development amongst young American evangelicals that became more sensitive towards the calls for justice and equality from the Palestinian communities. And it's a big development, huge development, almost unexpected, and it is difficult to explain it. Is it related to theology? Is it related to cultural, social changes? Is it a generational revolt against a generation of their fathers? But this can be capitalized upon. But in order to do so, you really have to become aware of what is the theology of American evangelicals and how it can change, to have room of flexibility. So it can be an interesting development, I think.
Yeah. Ofer, anything to add sort of on what then all of these developments inside of the evangelical movement in the US, but also sort of reflecting the current scenario that we find ourselves in the US. Sort of what might this mean for US-Israel relations?
Both societies are increasingly polarized, and this is one of the reasons that worldviews are increasingly salient in them. In the US, to put it very simplistically, we see a stronger thrust also shaped by social justice theory among more secular constituencies. We see sort of more traditional perspectives within the Democratic and Republican parties that are perhaps somewhat more guided by interests than an explicit theology. And we see US evangelicals with all of these varieties that Jeff and Carlo underlined. And because of this polarization, there is a difficulty for members, for people who in a way adhere to these different worldviews to support the same policies. They compete with each other. What we are seeing, of course, in the last decade at least, is some degree of unraveling, therefore, of bipartisan policies in the US in general and also towards Israel. This creates much more complicated political relationships between the two countries, on the one hand, and between Americans and Palestinians, on the other hand. A relationship with a foreign stakeholder is more and more painted as belonging to a specific constituency, affiliated with certain positions. One of the most interesting things that the Biden administration has done in this respect was its decision to continue with the Abraham Accords, a clear fruit of the Trump administration, for better and worse, but really to persist with this, to deliver on promises that the Trump administration has made to the UAE, to Morocco in particular, which many Democrats found very controversial. And nevertheless, to continue to do this in order to produce, at least in effect, some kind of bipartisan policies. Otherwise, one can witness such a high degree of oscillation that there is no political stability, and the very fact that there is such polarization within the US could therefore exacerbate other conflicts. What the current Israeli government is trying to do is to, in a way, restore the capacity to work with both political parties in the US simultaneously, secure support from both of them. And the PLO is trying to now repair relations with the US in a way that also will endure future change of administration, so that if they manage to repair relations with a Democratic administration, it will also continue if there is later a Republican one. So really, I think the deepest dynamic from an identity point of view is how this identity-related polarization does not jeopardize any kind of long-lasting policies.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So you mentioned another important topic, of course. So the Abraham Accords, which of course continue to exist also under this administration, U.S. administration, as you have mentioned. And I mean, an interesting question in relation to that might be sort of what kind of effect might the inclusion of an Arab Israeli party in the current Israeli government have, on the countries of the Abraham Accords, who all have different sort of varying degrees of how they see cooperation with Israel. What might this mean for this whole, in itself, very complicated setup?
I think I don't dare say anything with Ofer in the room. He's a major specialist on this.
Please, Ofer.
I think we just all saw in the news this week, as we record this, rather last week, a trip of the head of RAM, of this Arab-Palestinian party, to the palace in Amman for a meeting with the King of Jordan.
And of course, RAM being from having its root in the Muslim Brotherhood, which is something also interesting to mention in that regard. Yeah,
exactly. Mm-hmm. So everyone in the region saw the King of Jordan deciding to welcome the head of a party that is at least drawing inspiration from the Muslim Brotherhood in the palace for a public meeting, in order to discuss issues that are not only domestic Israeli, otherwise he would not probably meet him. So I think that we are seeing that RAM is gaining some degree of regional legitimacy. This poses questions also both for signatories of the Abraham Accords, Arab signatories, if it is the UAE, Morocco, and so on. Some of them are avowedly reluctant to support any element in the Muslim Brotherhood, some of them less. We saw Morocco, for instance, hosting Ismail Haniyeh, head of Hamas, in Morocco just a few months ago. And opponents of the Abraham Accords using this in order to delegitimize the agreements, in order to delegitimize Israel, claiming that any affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood in fact means that this is an illegitimate camp. So there is a politicization of this matter. I think more significantly, people are watching how pragmatic can you be when you draw inspiration from a theology shaped by the Muslim Brotherhood. What does it mean that this party decided to not only be part of the Israeli parliament, but the Israeli government? Is it something that is going to advance Palestinian interests, Islamic interests? Is it going to be something in which they cater only to their own narrow interests in a way that sort of betrays others? There are a lot of accusations of betrayal, of treason against them. I'm afraid that this is something that is too soon to say anything wise about, but I think that it's really a test case that can have historic ramifications. And from that point of view, it deserves close attention to analyze it from the prism of analyzing the Muslim Brotherhood movement in general, and what different evolutions within it have led to contrast it with the experience of Morsi in Egypt, of the Nahda in Tunis, Erdogan in Turkey, and really see which of these paths have led to what kind of achievements.
Hugely interesting perspective. Thank you so much. Jeff, anything to add?
No, not really. I mean, to bring this back to the U.S. context, I would just say one last thing. I'd really underscore something that Ofer and Carlo have each said about this sort of generational shift in the U.S. And I would also emphasize that it's not just within the evangelical Christian community, but also in the Jewish communities within the U.S. and this increased emphasis on sort of social justice, and there's a way in which youth perspectives within the Christian and Jewish communities in the U.S. either is perhaps becoming less polarized or perhaps repolarized in a new direction. I think it's too early to tell, but this is a super significant development, and we'll see what it means for U.S. policy towards the region and the conflict in the coming years.
Thank you so much for this really, really rich and interesting discussion, Carlo, Ofer, and Jeff. And this concludes our episode on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. See you next time. Subscribe to our podcast or visit the website insideconflict.com. For more information about the work of the ASPR, visit aspr.ac.at. Until next time.